the internet is no longer living up to the expectations that we had of it in the 1990s.
Welcome to Spotlight On, a podcast about how companies are built from the people doing the building, one messy, exhilarating decision at a time.
Welcome to Spotlight On. I'm your host, Amit Kumar, and I'm here with Avery Pennarun, the founder and CEO of Tailscale. Thanks, Avery, for joining us.
Hey, nice to be here.
Before we get into Tailscale and the founding story and what led you to this, maybe you could walk us through a little bit about your background. Who are you? And, you have a pretty remarkable background and lots of different things that you worked on. You came from Google. Maybe you could walk me through that a little bit.
In high school, I worked at the first internet provider in my hometown of Thunder Bay, running the systems there. There was the nonprofit version, the Freenet, and then I moved from there to the first commercial internet company where I set up their servers. I went from there off to the University of Waterloo, where we did co-op programs. So I worked at 6 different companies. One of those companies was one that I started because we should learn what it's like to start a startup. That one got a little out of control and ended up getting acquired by IBM in 2008. After that, I went and worked for a brief period in the banking industry, which was very educational, but turned out not to be my thing, really. Then I went off to Google. I worked on Google Fiber primarily, and some other side projects while I was there. And I came out of Google and wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do, but I decided I wanted to be back in the startup world. Like, big companies were not exactly my thing.
And what did you do at Google?
I started off in the Google Wallet team. So if you ever noticed the little attachment button at the bottom of an email that lets you attach money, that was the team that I was working on.
Your fault.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah. And, I wouldn't say that feature was spectacularly successful, but it launched and people used it. It was pretty interesting.
Cool.
And it required, it used my banking industry experience, which is the reason they put me on that team in the first place. And it was exciting because people had been trying to launch that feature for, I think, 5 years and just failing over and over again. And one way or another, I showed up and either got lucky or pushed it over the finish line, which was pretty fun. After that, I worked in Google Fiber, which of course is an internet service going back to my high school days, but maybe 1,000 times faster in terms of bandwidth. And there we were building Wi-Fi routers. So that was my team, building the home Wi-Fi routers that come with your internet service.
And then once you were out of Google and you were sort of exploring ideas, you had a friend at VersaBank who kind of pulled you in to solve a problem for them. So this wasn't even you ideating. This was just you trying to help out a buddy.
Yeah, he was stalking me on LinkedIn and found out that I was no longer employed. And the day after, which is also what he did my previous 2 jobs, the day after he found out I was unemployed, he's like, "Hey, Avery, I've got a problem. You want to help me fix this problem?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm thinking of starting a startup, but we don't have any ideas yet. So sure, why don't we go and try that?" And so, we went and visited him. And looked into his problem. It's oh, this is interesting. I bet we can solve this in a weekend. And we built the project in a weekend, and that project that we built turned into Tailscale.
What was the problem that they had that you needed to solve?
So the problem they had was they had banking software, and banking software is sort of famously not leading edge technology most of the time. But this banking software didn't have 2-factor authentication, and they had a security company come in, do an audit, and say hey, someone who can get the password from someone on your team could log into this banking software. And if you do a phishing test, which I don't really recommend, there's no point doing a phishing test because somebody at your company always fails the phishing test. But if you do a phishing test, you'll get maybe 20% of your team will accidentally give up their password, which meant it was definitely possible to break into the core banking system and start transferring money around. And they're look, we have to fix this problem. How do we get 2-factor authentication into this legacy banking software? And so we brainstormed for a while until eventually I said hey, what if instead of putting 2-factor authentication in the software, why don't we move the server onto a network and then VPN to the network and put 2-factor authentication in the VPN? And they said, "Don't know what you're talking about, but seems like a good idea." And we're all right, all I need to do is find a VPN that's going to be good if you leave it on all the time and you put it in the office and it uses 2-factor authentication and it integrates with your Azure AD. Surely I can just go buy that off the shelf and we'll be done and I'll go back to what I was doing. And I could not find a product that was going to be good enough to solve that problem. So I'm all right, fine. This new thing called WireGuard just came out. It's a really good VPN. It's super reliable. We can leave it on all the time. It's not going to break. I just need to make it work with 2-factor authentication. How hard can it be? So we slapped something together, plugged it into Azure AD, which I think was it still called Azure AD at the time? Maybe it was. I can't remember. Whatever Azure AD used to be called. We plugged it into that. And it was basically a key generator for WireGuard that we built in a weekend. And it worked. And he was really excited. And one thing that was interesting about it, this was pre-COVID. This was back in 2019. Shortly afterward, COVID hit. And because of the way the system worked, it was always VPNing into the network that ran the banking server. as he could send all of his employees home on their laptops and nothing changed. They didn't have to reconfigure anything, and still their banking software worked, which is this like weird side benefit that we hadn't even been planning for. And when that happened, we sort of realized we actually had something on our hands. It's like, wait a minute, what? This is way more powerful than we intended.
That was the moment when you thought that lots of companies need to be using this.
Yeah, because we originally thought we were going to do like a bootstrap software company. Why don't we just like slap some stuff together?
Right.
We can pay 3 or 4 people, no problem, with a relatively small product. Who cares? And we just like realize this thing is like, whoa, we can fix so much stuff. This deserves to be a bigger project that we can't just self-fund.
Maybe walking back a little bit, how did you form the early team to go after this? And then what was the process about going after and kind of scaling out from one customer to kind of an early set? And one thing I think all our listeners know is that Tailscale's done an incredible job of building the most special community of folks and developers that love Tailscale. I mean, there's this unique product love in the community. Like, how did you go from 0 to 1 when it comes to that?
Right, well, this is where, like, and I know people don't always believe me when I say this because I'm Canadian and people accuse me of being too modest, but like, I'm telling the truth here. We didn't know what we were doing. And we're like, well, look, our costs are really low. Let's try some stuff and see what happens. So the first thing we did is we took this package we had made for this bank. We're like, well, I don't actually want to be an enterprise software company. And it's a long story, but a previous startup that I did accidentally turned into an enterprise software company. I did not enjoy it very much, right? What I want to do is build software for like people that I can talk to that are more like me, so engineers. And like, nowadays, and maybe even at the time, but I was a little out of the loop. Nowadays, this is like considered a normal thing. I build a startup for engineers because engineers are going to buy stuff bottom up. But I never heard of any of this. I've been in Google for like 7 years. And before that, I built software like in the pre-SaaS days. So it turned out the path that we took is very standard, but I didn't know that. I'm just like, I don't want to build enterprise software. We built this cool thing. Why don't we see if we can make something that like people can just install on their own and then play with at small companies, like what our company is. And so we like fine-tuned it a little bit and slapped it on our website, and it was really not very good. But we wrote a blog post about it. And for whatever reason, when I write blog posts, they frequently end up on Hacker News front page. This one ended up on the Hacker News front page, and we got zillions of people coming to our website saying, hey, this looks neat. And the problem is we didn't have a sign-up system or a registration system or a user activation system. We actually had all of the users in the system hard-coded in the source code of the server. And so I got, and the way you connected was you like fill in your name and push this button, and it puts you in the so-called waiting list. And the waiting list is a CSV file, which I would read every few minutes and then go through the emails and send them an email saying how to activate after I inserted their email address into our source code and activated their account. And I did that like several hundred times in one night. So I was up for like 24 hours straight, just like activating people because we had to build the sign-up system. Now I forgot what the question was. Oh, yeah. And so that was the clue that maybe something cool was happening, because the feedback we started getting. The nice thing about this method, I expected like 5 people on the waiting list, and then I could have a conversation with 5 people. Instead, I was having a conversation with hundreds of people that I had to email personally to tell them they'd been activated. And this is an amazing way to like get feedback on your product, because they know the CEO of this company is talking to them right now. Right. And so we got tons of feedback on what the product could do and ideas for what the product should do, but also a lot of positive, like, oh my God, this thing is amazing. I can't believe how great this is. You're already so much better than anything else I've seen in this category.
Well, you sort of joked, and I know it's not entirely a joke, that, you didn't know what you were doing, but your intuitions have always been right. And I think one of the things the community has really appreciated about you and Tailscale and, all the folks who work there is you guys sort of try to do things the right way. You guys are very transparent, very honest with customers in the community. I think people have responded to that. I also think you benefit from selling to developers and building for developers, right? Your intuition is probably better for that than for enterprise SaaS, but it's just easier and better to communicate with those people directly.
Even that, I don't want to give it too much credit. My intuition is listen to people, like actually, and then give them what they want, right? And I know a lot of people believe I think there's what is the Ford saying? If you just listened to customers, we would have built a faster horse, or whatever it is. And it's like, look, people really like faster horses. But the trick is, like, sometimes you can listen, and the important thing is to understand the problem they're trying to solve. Right. And if you understand the problem you're trying to solve, then maybe you can come up with a more clever way to solve the problem. You don't have to implement it just like they said, but you have to give them the thing that they said they want. Right. If they said they wanted to be able to connect to their banking software using two-factor authentication, you have to find a way to let them connect to their banking software using two-factor authentication. You can't just tell them, like, no, two-factor authentication is not
the solution.
Right. And so when these people tried out Tailscale, they said, like, wow, this is really amazing. but I wish it could do this and this and this, then you can listen to them and actually give them what they want. And so my addition to that, maybe the part that makes Tailscale unusual, is it comes from the name Tailscale, which was sort of the founding principle. We didn't know what we were going to build, but we knew how we were going to build it, which is like everybody in the world makes everything too complicated now, right? It's all based on this like Google advanced super scaling stuff from the early 2000s, back when computers were like literally 1,000 times slower than they are today, right? And it's like, I want to make a giant distributed system because it's cool to make giant distributed systems. But to do that, everything has to be hard. And so you get to the point where people are like, to launch my website, I created a Kubernetes cluster and then made it auto scaling and blah, 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 blah. And like, you know what? My website runs on the minimum cost Linode node, right? Using a little Python script that I start by hand from the command line, right? And whenever I want to change the Python script, I like edit the one file that's the Python script, and then I kill it and restart it. Right. And like that's Avery's website, which can handle as much load as anyone will ever throw at Avery's website because it's not that good, but every now and then it gets a popular blog post. Right. And almost every project in the world is like that scale of difficulty, or maybe 10 times or 100 times as hard as that, which is still not very hard. Like Google levels of difficulty is millions of requests per second that have to be served in like 100 milliseconds, and they're searching the entire internet. Like to do that, you need a monster size system, but virtually guaranteed your problem is not that hard. And so Tailscale is like, look, if you have a problem that hard, we're not going to try to fix it for you, right? If you have a problem that's easier than that, we can do it a totally different way, and we'll just go straight to solving your problem and not just get lost in all of the complexity.
I think it's an incredible insight, and it also just gives me PTSD because I started a series of very unsuccessful companies. But of course, you build these companies thinking that millions of people are going to come and billions of requests are going to happen at the same time, and you sort of prematurely scale all these systems. And to the point you're making, you know, there are a few very special and lucky companies that have to hit those scale metrics and numbers, but you know, most everybody else is solving for something much smaller or different.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest risk when you're small is that you're not going to build something useful. Right. And so you need to build something useful as fast as you possibly can. Once it turns out to be useful, then first of all, it's easier to get funding. But secondly, you've got revenue coming in. You can take the revenue, you can invest it in engineering, you can fix the stuff you didn't fix later. There's this principle that I learned a long time ago. It comes from the like so-called extreme programming people that evolved into Agile, and it's called YAGNI. You aren't going to need it. Right. And this is the principle is like, if you're not sure you need it right now, just assume you're not going to need it, because most of the time building that stuff is not going to be any harder later than it is right now, which means like you should always push off that investment as long as you possibly can in case you don't need to spend it. Right. And this is an amazingly useful principle you can apply to almost everything. And even if it's a little more expensive later than it is right now, you're going to have a lot more money later than you have right now. So you should always do the things you do need to do right now, because there's an unlimited list of those anyway. Right. So don't like imagine things that you might need to do and then do them right now. You can wait.
I know we talked about this at the last company offsite, but I'm still amazed, you know, how great it's been to work together. But we come from such different backgrounds, and yet I think we actually did make the right choice and ended up working together. It's been awesome.
Yeah. So I have to say, one of the things I liked about Excel was they were an investor in UUNet a long, long time ago. Yeah. UUNet was the link that my first job in Thunder Bay, when we had this first internet service, that's how they got to the internet. And so I'm like, oh, these people have good taste in internet providers, or at least they did like 30 years ago. And probably you didn't have much to do with that. But you know,
thank God for Arthur.
Yeah, but you know, you're the sort of successor in a long line of people with good judgment. Is sort of what I was thinking.
Well, you know, let's hope that lineage has continued with Tailscale. So we made the investment in July or August of 2020, and everything has been rosy ever since. Right, like things have gone extremely well, and nothing has ever gone wrong.
Correct.
At the company.
Yes, it's actually very unusual. Nothing ever goes wrong.
Yeah.
No, that's not true.
It's obviously been a journey, and there've been challenges, there's been obstacles, the company's had to do a lot of growing up. What were one or two crucible moments for you as you think about, you know, critical junctures, things that you got right, hard decisions that you had to make that, you know, you look back on and you're like, you know what, like in the fog of war, that felt like a really critical moment, but now on the other side of it, we made a really great decision. Maybe we made a really hard decision.
My philosophy generally around doing a startup is make your mistakes as cheap as possible so that you can just recover quickly, and don't go into denial about the truth about things. So most things that we've done wrong, and there's been like, you know, uncountable numbers of them, have just like not turned into some big spiral that anybody would point at and say, oh my God, biggest mistake of my life. Because we was like, ooh, that didn't work. And then we turn it around in like a month or a few weeks and it's gone. Right.
Yeah.
We've gone in directions with the Tailscale product. For example, we've put out features that have not really taken off.
Yeah.
Right. Or even if they did take off, we realized they pulled in like the kind of users who are not the most profitable users. And it's like, this is a great feature, but it's not the one that is going to like move the business forward right now.
Yeah.
An example is Taildrop, which everybody loves Taildrop once they hear about it. Right. It's sort of like AirDrop on your Apple devices, but it doesn't require an Apple device and it doesn't require them to be side by side, but it lets you send a file between any device and any other device, point to point, encrypted without sending it up through a server and for free. It's like, well, that sounds great. That could be a whole product. It's like, it could, but it's kind of consumery. And we didn't need to go right now in the consumery direction because we have all these engineers, and the way Tailscale works is all these engineers, most of them have jobs. Some of them bring it to work. Some of the people who bring it to work end up using it at work and paying us.
Yeah.
Right. And that's great. And we're going to eventually invest more in the consumery direction, but there's so much opportunity in this direction with just engineers that I'll say we should have instead put the energy into more engineering stuff. But it's not like we wasted a lot of energy. Taildrop was like a 3-month project for our 10-person team, right? And it created a whole bunch of buzz, and that whole bunch of buzz caused the word of mouth to go up. So was it a mistake? It's like, there's probably something we could have done that would have been
There
better,
might have been
but
a
it was-
more efficient path.
Yeah, but it was not a very expensive mistake.
Right.
Our most expensive mistakes have been in the direction of like, we didn't really figure out marketing for a really long time.
Yeah.
And it's funny to say that because when I say that to investors, and when I said it to investors in our Series A and our Series B, they're like, what are you talking about? You're so good at marketing. I'm like, I'm not. You have no idea.
Yeah.
Tailscale marketing.
He's not kidding. We're not good at marketing. We might be now, though.
We are suddenly getting much better at marketing.
Yeah.
And that completely relates to our new VP of marketing, Sydney,
Yeah.
who really gets it, right? But before that, like all of our success was through word of mouth. Like literally, our website didn't matter. We did an A/B test at one point, and we just replaced the front page with a giant button that said "Download Tailscale," and that actually increased our sign-up rate because the only people who went to our website were the ones whose friends had been clubbing over the head saying you need to go download Tailscale. Right. So they would Google for the word Tailscale, which is like still the number one reason anyone shows up on our website. Right. Somebody told them to Google for the word Tailscale. Then they click on Tailscale. Right. And then they dig around trying to find the download button. Right. And that's great. That means your word of mouth multiplier is really high, but that means we weren't doing marketing properly. Yeah. And the reason we weren't doing marketing properly had to do with like, how do you hire people? How do you find the right person who's really good at the stuff that you're not good at? Right. Because I'm pretty good at hiring people to do the things that I am good at. Like many engineers can spot another good engineer. Right. So we hired a bunch of great engineers, but like anything I'm not good at, how do I know? And even if they're good at it, maybe they're not the right person for your company, right? Like marketing has like 100 different variations of how you should do it. Somebody who's really good at one of the variations, that variation might not be the right one for your company. And so eventually we've tried many different iterations, but to get to our current VP of marketing, for example, I had to interview dozens and dozens and dozens of people and find out how they did it and ask for people's advice and ask for their advice and like, what do you think about this? Until I finally found somebody who like explained to me how my company should work.
Avery, what's been surprising, when you build a really powerful tool? I mean, of course, there are like obvious ways to use it. What have been some surprising use cases that have emerged, as Tailscale's become more and more popular?
People use Tailscale for really unexpected use cases. One of the most recent ones is as we were like grinding through our data about like who's using Tailscale, we found that like 5 of the 5 top or AI companies were using Tailscale, and then we found that like hundreds of not the top 5 AI companies were also using Tailscale, and we're like, oh, why? I don't know any of these people. They all just signed up through self-serve and never contacted us, right? So we had to dig around and find out like, okay, what about Tailscale makes us popular with AI companies? And the answer is basically they're all stuck with multi-cloud. They all have to deal with some GPUs. They're probably all using Kubernetes, and they all have like all of these like, they have connectivity problems, but they don't want to invest in a networking team. They're a bunch of really smart engineers who are AI engineers, and networking is just getting in their way. And they just want to spend some money to make networking problems go away. And they had all heard of us because they're early adopters, and they were all mostly living in San Francisco, and like everybody in San Francisco now knows about Tailscale. And so AI companies just like across the board started adopting Tailscale for everything. And this is, again, it's great. It was a surprise, but if we'd been on top of our game, we would have seen that coming and maybe put some work into it. Like at the time, you could search for AI Tailscale and not find anything on our website. There was not a single mention of the word AI anywhere, or machine learning, or LLM, or GPU, right? Like there was nothing. Our website was not serving it at all. Other people were telling other people, oh, you work in AI, you should do this. And like they go to an AI conference and people are like, oh, how do I connect to my GPU? It sucks. And like, oh, I have Tailscale. You should try it. It's free trial, right? And just like took off. More recently, we found out retroactively that Tailscale is a service mesh. And I'm like, I don't even know what a service mesh is. But I'm talking to customers, and we have customers who are like, oh, well, we threw out our old service mesh, and now we're using Tailscale as a service mesh. Tailscale is a service mesh. And I'm like, I'm going to have to go Google some stuff. Let me come back. And so now I know what a service mesh is. A service mesh is a combination of connectivity, identity, and service discovery, right? And Tailscale obviously does connectivity and identity, which is the thing that it does. I never thought of it as a service discovery system, but it turns out the architecture of Tailscale is that it keeps a list of all the devices in your network because it had to generate encryption keys and track them and distribute them. And then it tells each node about each other node. And then each node has a list of nodes, and you can query it and say, like, who's the list of nodes that match this criteria? And that turns out to be a service discovery mechanism. And some of our customers realized that we did these three things and are like, out with the old service mesh thing and put in Tailscale. And again, it's like there's not a single mention of the word service mesh anywhere on the Tailscale website. Actually, that might still be true today. People are actively working on it. They're going to be launching web pages that say service mesh sometime soon.
That's awesome.
Right? But it's like these kinds of things where it's like you just have to, at this point, we have to keep our eyes out for what people are already doing and then listen to them and then tell the story back and improve the experience that they're having.
It wouldn't be a Tailscale podcast if I didn't at least give you the layup of telling you about crossing the chasm. And I think this AI sort of pervasiveness, allowed you to keep like resurrecting crossing the chasm in board meetings for at least another like 2 years. So could you maybe just talk about that? Because I know it's like one of your guiding principles as you think about the company, and in particular for the motion that you have of getting ubiquity within developers. How is that? Can you just tell us, the audience, about that, and then how that's guided some of your decision making?
I guess the history of this, I was introduced to the book Crossing the Chasm by one of my investors at my very first startup, toward the end of the cycle of that startup, when we were struggling. We had like growing revenues, but it was really hard to grow the revenues. And in retrospect, what happened was we were stuck with basically early adopter customers. And there were lots of early adopter customers, and we were pushing really hard. We had a sales team like searching as hard as they could to find early adopter customers. But like every single thing was like just push. And they're like, well, Avery, you should read this book. It kind of explains what's happening. I'm like, how can a book explain what's happening? We have a unique situation. Nobody's ever done this before, blah, blah, blah. And like, I read the book, and the format of the book, every chapter is like, here's what people usually think you should do. Here's what happens when you do that, and here's what you should do instead. And so I like opened up chapter 1. It's like, oh, that's what I did. Oh, that is what happened. Oh, that's what I should have done instead. And then you go to the next chapter, and the same and the same. And it's like the story of our entire startup from beginning to where we were, and a recipe for what to do to fix it, right? And so I I decided to follow the recipe, and then within like 6 months, the business turned around. Right. But by then it was too late. We'd been doing it for like 8 years. We were running out of money. Investor didn't want to put in more money. The first investors were like getting impatient. And so we exited IBM. But if I had had that same exact advice like 4 or 5 years sooner, it could have been a completely different company, because we had the product that we needed. We didn't know how to cross this chasm. Right. And the secret of crossing the chasm is just to figure out how to become the default product that everybody uses for some use case. And the thing that nobody realizes, the super counterintuitive part, is that use case, that group of people, has to be tiny, because you're not going to win. You're not going to be the default solution. That's more than 50% is like how you be the winning default solution. Right. You're not going to be the bigger than 50% of anything big when you're tiny. Right. So everybody wants to go after this thing with a giant total addressable market. They want to find some market that's like humongous and tell their investors, like, don't worry, there's like $10 billion of possibility here, or $1 trillion. Right. It's like, that's not how you succeed when you're tiny. Right. The way you succeed is you find something really small, and you win that really small thing by telling everybody, like, look, nope, maybe you don't have to say this out loud to the customer, but like, this is too tiny for anybody to care about. But I care because I'm also tiny. So we're going to give you the best possible service and go out of our way to make the best possible thing. And then when you win that, then you can win something adjacent and something adjacent to that and something adjacent to that, and it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So our like the secret strategy of Tailscale, and again, it feeds into the name. Like we accept the idea of doing small things.
Yeah.
Right. And so Tailscale is always going after like, what is the small thing that we can do next that we're going to win easily. Right. And AI was one of the things where like, okay, we actually were kind of late. We already won it before we noticed that we had won it. Right. AI networking, I should say. And then, the service mesh thing again is like, oh, we're not winning, but it's actually like, I looked it up the other day. The service mesh market is not that big in terms of dollars right now. It's actually achievable to make a splash in the service mesh market. Right. And so we'll keep doing things like that and growing like incrementally. But it's such a good book because it explains why this works in I'm a systems design kind of person, but it explains it in a systems design sort of way. Like, this is why systems like this always happen. And when you do the obvious thing, this is why it always doesn't work.
Avery, how do you think about monetizing or charging for what you've built at Tailscale? I mean, you started off with this amazing community. It's very bottoms up. You have individual developers. You talked about this motion of developers at home using it and then bringing it to work. How do you think about charging and, kind of growing up into a business over time?
Sure. So I said earlier that like I didn't want to build an enterprise software company, which is true, but I want to maybe I should qualify that because like obviously our first customer was a bank. As Tailscale is suitable for enterprise.
Yeah.
But I want to like make the internet a better place, right? And if you're going to fix the internet, if you're going to fix this like low-level protocol of TCP/IP and get it out to everybody, then it has to be literally everybody. Everybody includes enterprises, but it includes everybody else. And so Tailscale, my other favorite business book is called The Innovator's Dilemma. And if I was to summarize it in like one line, it's like nobody ever goes down market. They only ever go up market. And so if you start up market, you're never going to go back down. Right. So Tailscale, our policy is like, we are going to make sure that the $0 part of the market is ours. And we're going to do that by A, giving away the product to people who want to use it for free, and B, making sure that it's cost effective to give away the product to people for free. Because what I can't have is just I'm going to raise a bunch of money from investors and then spend all that money giving away like AWS credits or something like that so that people can have the product for free. So I have this blog post called How Tailscale Remains Free. And it explains the architecture of Tailscale and why it doesn't cost us anything for you to have your free account. And if it doesn't cost us anything for you to have your free account, we can keep giving it out to lots of people. And in fact, in the early days of Tailscale, because, I talked about how in the very early days, we didn't even have a sign-up system that was not Avery sending you an email. But later, we're like, okay, well, we have lots of work to do. Why should we implement restrictions on what customers can do? So there was no actual limits. Like if you bought a 10-user account, or if you didn't buy anything, there was nothing stopping you from signing up another 100 or few hundred users. And that's what we actually got. And so when we hired our first few salespeople, job was just like, hey, we've got some customers with like hundreds of seats. They never actually emailed us. We should probably tell them that they're actually supposed to pay for the product. And if you dug around, if you actually went to the billing page, it would tell you like whether you were over your subscription.
Yeah.
But it was very Canadian. It said like, hey, it's great that you're trying this thing. Probably you should pay us sometime. I can't remember the exact wording, but it was kind of like that.
I was told the people at Excel that the company is capital C Canadian and lower C capitalist. It's stories
exactly.
like that.
But as a Canadian, I want to point out that despite all of that, the amount of revenue that we could capture by going out and collecting all the money from people who were underpaying us was only about 20% extra. That means like 80% of the people in the world were paying us, even though there was absolutely positively nothing making them do that, right? Because most people in the world are honest. And that is, a fundamental belief of Canadians, of course, but also like, that extra 20%, like I could afford to have that 20% for the huge amount of word of mouth that it produced. But anyway, so as Tailscale has been getting bigger, we have a more structured sales team now. I actually got complaints from various people that I knew. It's like when they signed up for Tailscale and started using it, they're like, Avery, you're doing something wrong. I'm not going to pay you until somebody reaches out to me and tells me to pay. Like my own friends were telling me this. It's like, Avery, fix your company. It doesn't make sense. Nobody's going to be mad because they've got 50 seats that they're really enjoying and somebody emails them saying like, oh, we should have a discussion about dollars now, right? And so we started doing that. We have a real professional sales team. We still don't actually enforce too many limits, but the sales team will catch you sooner and invite a conversation, right? And so we've been getting bigger and bigger now, and we're starting to actually do our first like $1 million plus deals. And so when I said I don't want to do enterprise sales, it's like somebody now, we have employees. There are people who are going to do the enterprise sales, but I have to remember like where we came from.
Yeah.
And where we came from is individual engineers who love the product. They use it at home. They bring it to work. They use it in small teams. And eventually it turns into a system where people buy it top down and roll it out to the whole company. And so that's where Tailscale, like the whole vision of the new internet, like it can scale all the way down from 0 to maximum. And that's how you get the new TCP/IP rolled out to everybody.
You talked about transferring files between devices. You talked about two-factor authentication. You talked about VPNs. You talked about connecting devices. And now you're talking about service mesh. And you're talking about, hey, AI networking. How do you think about defining the vision for the company? I mean, when you stand up at an all hands in front of the whole company, how do you describe to them what the future looks like? And what does that mean to you in terms of the mission of the business and what the implications are on the world that we're headed towards?
Well, I'm kind of workshopping this one. The way we have been saying it.
We'll do it live. Let's go.
Yeah,
okay.
exactly.
Okay. Yeah.
So what we say is like Tailscale is the new internet. And I like it because it's funny, because there's a TV show, Silicon Valley, where like the main characters made this thing that was called the new internet. And it was just like a series of laughs. But actually, the internet needs to be fixed. And what I mean by that is like, as an engineer, TCP/IP is the problem, right? And we've known this since the 1990s. IPv4 is not good enough. They tried to launch IPv6. IPv6 should have solved a whole bunch of our networking problems. Have your networking problems been solved by IPv6? No, right? And why not? Large part of it is the thing has not fully rolled out. And why didn't the thing fully roll out? It didn't roll out because it didn't follow crossing the chasm, right? Like they didn't have a rollout plan that was going to win, and it still hasn't won, right? And it doesn't look like it's going to win. If you look at the trend line, it looks like maybe in the next 40 or 50 years, maybe they will get to like 80 or 90% adoption.
Right.
And it's like, I might be dead by then, right? I've been like waiting for IPv6 my entire life, right? And it's not solving the problem. Like IPv6 was the chosen one. It didn't work out. The new internet didn't happen. It was the new internet. So what are you going to do about it? Right? Tailscale is actually, and again, it was kind of by accident because I just wanted to fix some problems. Tailscale is this thing you insert at the IP layer that makes the internet work the way the internet was supposed to work, right? And when the internet works the way it was supposed to work, any device can talk to any device. You've got safety, you've got security, you've got encryption, you've got identity, you've got like easy to set up. You don't think about it anymore. It just works properly, right? And when things work properly, like one of the things that's hard to explain about the vision is like when people were inventing TCP/IP, they didn't really think that big. They were like, you know what? I want to be able to access the supercomputer at my university from another university. It's like, that sounds neat, but it doesn't sound like the internet we have today, right? The internet we have today is used for everything all the time, right? I have internet on my watch. If I bought a watch and it didn't have internet, I'd be like, why am I paying for this? It's broken, right? And like nobody thought about that.
We used to call them smartwatches. Now we just call them watches.
Exactly. Or smartphones. Like when was the last time you phoned somebody on your phone, right? Like it's so what is the vision for Tailscale? The vision for Tailscale, like fundamentally on an engineering level, is like, look, we just need to fix the thing that we call the internet and replace it with this new thing. And the layers on top can be actually the same, but a whole bunch of stuff is going to work better, right? And then how do you explain like what's the business value of that? What are people going to do with it? It's like it's a little hard to explain because most of the uses for Tailscale haven't been imagined yet, right? And I think the only way I can explain that is through that analogy. And so even though it's a joke, like the new internet analogy is actually the right analogy. Like the internet is no longer living up to the expectations that we had of it in the 1990s because IPv6 didn't work. And even if IPv6 did roll out now, it's been 25 years since it was designed. It's missing some stuff that we would have put into it if we designed it today. But it's just been like stuck. And if you unstuck something that's 25 years old in the tech world, you're going to get a whole bunch of benefits.
Okay, so that was incredible, by the way. That was pretty good. Pretty good for a workshop. If you could go back and give any feedback or advice or wisdom to Avery outside of Reed crossing the chasm 4 years earlier, what would you tell him?
I think Tailscale, we did a really good job building the company through the first several phases. I think what we didn't do a fantastic job of is as we're switching from what I would call a like early stage startup to a growth stage startup, you really have to restructure the way the company works to make it more scalable, right? And that means building an executive team in the right structure so that you can like help people like get their work done when not everybody is going to be able to know what everybody else is doing all the time. And so I didn't do a super great job of creating the structure inside the company that I probably shouldn't. Like the organization of the executive team is really important. You don't need to be super innovative. There's like, again, you're not the first person to build a company, right?
Yeah.
And so there's lots of advice you can find on like, okay, what's the good structure of an executive team? How do you choose what roles should go here? There's only a few structures that like reliably work. And so you don't want to innovate on everything in your company. It's great to be innovative on the technology side, but you don't need to invent everything. You don't need to invent your own accounting systems, finance systems, and so on. The most important thing for me when building an executive team that I learned is like actually executive search companies are amazing and they're worth their weight in gold, much more than I realized, because the main thing they do is they introduce you to lots and lots of great candidates, some of whom you won't even be able to land, some of whom you don't even want to land, but you get such a wide array of information about what's possible in a particular role that after you've talked to like 25 or 30 of these people, then you can understand what perfect looks like for you. Right. And when you're a tiny little company and you're only hiring one executive, it doesn't matter if there's not 100 different people who can fit that exact role that you've invented. If there's just one person who can do that exact combination of things that you want, you can just find that one person. And that one person is really going to want to work there because it's the job that's absolutely perfect for them. Right. And we've found like that kind of executives, but I didn't realize before that it was possible to do that because I didn't connect to the fact, ironically, given that Tailscale is all about small things, right? I didn't really connect to the fact that you only need one perfect person for this job. And that person is there somewhere. And you can just go find them, but it's going to be a lot of work. And an executive search firm will help do that.
It's awesome. Yeah, I think you've done a really good job like in those situations. One thing I've grown to really appreciate about you is you definitely take time to get all the data, but once you have the data, I really trust your decision making. And it's worked out pretty well for us.
My comment on data is I love data, but in fact, like most of the most useful data in my life turns out to be like anecdata or like building an intuition for something. So maybe I'll stare at the data for a long time and it's like, okay, I think I understand what the pattern is now, and then close down the dashboard and like with the idea about the pattern, you talk to people, you get advice. What's the pattern of advice? What's the standard way to do things? Are we really special enough to be breaking this pattern, or should we just do the standard way to do things? And then just like, there's a little bit of like just following your intuition, but to make your intuition smart enough requires a lot of studying, which is how I do it.
It's awesome. Avery, thanks for joining us. You're a great dude.
Yeah.